The town had less than 10 minutes left, and only one dog seemed to know it. Scout burst from the smoke like a shadow carved from firelight. His golden coat was stained gray with ash, and every breath came fast and sharp as he sprinted down the empty main street of Cedar Hollow. In his mouth hung a small piece of red fabric, torn and blackened at the edges. He did not slow down. He did not hesitate. The church bell tower stood silent above the sleeping town while the sky behind the western ridge glowed an unnatural orange. Most people were still inside their homes. Some were finishing dinner. Others were settling into their evening routines, unaware that the dry forest surrounding their community had become a living wall of heat and smoke. The wind carried the scent of burning pine through the valley, but few noticed. In wildfire country, faint smoke was not unusual. Panic had not arrived yet. Disaster was still hidden behind the hills. Scout raced across the intersection, paws striking the pavement in a frantic rhythm. His ears were pinned back. His amber eyes were wide with urgency. A passing pickup truck slowed as the driver noticed the dog darting through the haze. Scout ignored it. He was focused on something far more important. Behind him, nearly 2 miles away, flames were advancing through the forest faster than anyone had predicted. Gusts approaching 30 miles per hour pushed sparks across the drought-stricken terrain. Fire crews stationed outside the valley believed they still had time. The latest projections suggested the town would remain safe through the night. They were wrong. Scout reached the small volunteer rescue station near the edge of town and began barking. Loud, relentless, desperate. The sound echoed through the parking lot. Inside the building, radios crackled softly while a handful of rescue workers reviewed evacuation maps. They had been monitoring conditions all afternoon, but nothing suggested immediate danger. One volunteer glanced toward the window. Another shook his head. It was probably just a frightened dog. But Scout would not stop. He barked again, then again. Then he began pacing in circles, glancing toward the western ridge before returning to the station door. Something about the way he moved felt different. Intentional, urgent, almost pleading. The evening air grew hotter. Tiny flecks of ash drifted from the darkening sky like gray snow. Scout suddenly ran several yards away before turning back toward the building. He barked once more and lowered his body, staring directly at the rescue workers inside. For a brief moment, everything became still. The wind paused. The street fell silent. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to disappear. Then a low rumble rolled across the valley. Not thunder, not machinery, something older, something heavier. The sound of a wildfire finding new fuel. Scout's ears twitched. He immediately turned and sprinted toward the western road. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back, waiting, watching, as if he needed someone to follow, as if the fate of an entire town depended on whether one person understood what he was trying to say. The first person to move was Captain Ethan Walker. He had spent nearly 14 years working search and rescue operations across the Pacific Northwest, and experience had taught him one thing. Animals rarely wasted energy on panic, especially not a dog that looked this determined. Ethan stepped outside the station and immediately felt the change in the air. The temperature had climbed several degrees in less than an hour. The breeze carried a stronger scent of burning timber now, mixed with dry earth and something sharper that made the back of his throat tighten. Scout was already 50 yards down the road. The Labrador stopped beside an old roadside sign and looked back again, waiting. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That dog is trying to tell us something," he said quietly. A few members of the rescue team exchanged uncertain glances. One volunteer checked the latest wildfire report on a tablet. The screen still showed no immediate evacuation order. Another firefighter pointed toward the western ridge. Through the growing haze, the distant glow had become easier to see. Not dramatic, not terrifying, just enough to create a feeling that something was changing faster than anyone expected. Scout barked again. The sound echoed through the valley. Then he turned and ran. This time Ethan did not hesitate. He climbed into the rescue truck and motioned for 2 team members to follow. The engine started with a low rumble. Tires rolled across the pavement as they headed west. Ahead of them, Scout raced along the shoulder of the road, moving with surprising speed. The farther they traveled, the thicker the smoke became. Pine trees lined both sides of the highway, their dark silhouettes fading behind a gray veil. Ash drifted through the headlights even though the sun had not completely set. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. After several minutes, Scout suddenly veered onto a narrow service road that most people barely noticed. Ethan recognized it immediately. It led toward the oldest section of Cedar Hollow, a small cluster of homes built decades before newer neighborhoods expanded eastward. Many elderly residents still lived there. Several families had occupied those houses for generations. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. The rescue truck bounced over uneven gravel as they followed the dog. Radio traffic crackled through the cab. Reports were becoming more urgent. Wind speeds had increased again. Fire behavior was becoming unpredictable. Forecast models were being updated in real time. None of that explained why Scout had chosen this particular road. Then they rounded a bend. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Smoke was already drifting between the houses. Not thick enough to cause panic. Not yet, but close enough to raise alarm. More troubling was what he noticed next. The neighborhood remained completely calm. Porch lights glowed warmly. A man watered flowers near a fence. Children rode bicycles near a corner mailbox. No evacuation sirens. No warnings. No indication that danger was moving toward them much faster than anyone realized. Scout stopped near the center of the street. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His tail remained low. Then he began running from yard to yard, barking at every house he passed. Doors opened. Residents stepped outside. Confused faces appeared in windows. Ethan slowly climbed out of the truck and stared toward the western horizon. Beyond the smoke, he could now see something that made his heart sink. The orange glow was no longer hidden behind a ridge. It was moving, and it was moving directly towards Cedar Hollow. Captain Ethan Walker had spent years learning how emergencies unfolded. Most disasters arrived with warnings. Sirens, alerts, phone calls. But the most dangerous ones were the quiet disasters, the ones that looked ordinary until the final moment. As he stood in the middle of the neighborhood, watching ash drift across the streetlights, an old memory surfaced without warning. 7 years earlier, another wildfire had swept through a mountain community nearly 80 miles north of Cedar Hollow. Ethan had been part of the rescue operation then. The forecasts had been wrong. The winds had shifted. Families who believed they had hours suddenly had minutes. Nobody forgot that day, least of all Ethan. He remembered the smoke. He remembered the confusion. Most of all, he remembered a young firefighter named Ryan Walker. His younger brother. Ryan had always been fearless, always the first to volunteer when others hesitated. They had worked side by side for years. Then one unexpected change in the fire's path separated their crews. By the time Ethan reached the evacuation zone, Ryan had already been moved to safety, but the experience changed both of them. Since then, Ethan had learned to trust instincts when facts lagged behind reality. Now those same instincts were speaking again. He looked toward Scout. The Labrador was moving restlessly between houses, barking and nudging at residents who stepped outside. There was nothing random about his behavior. He was focused, intentional, as if he understood something nobody else could see. Ethan grabbed his radio. "I want immediate evacuation notifications for this entire neighborhood," he said firmly. "Do not wait for confirmation from the county." One of the rescue workers hesitated. "Captain, official orders have not come through yet." Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the western ridge. The orange glow had grown brighter, the smoke thicker. "Then we move before they do." For a moment, nobody argued. The urgency in his voice carried more weight than any report. Within minutes, volunteers spread through the neighborhood. Doors were knocked on. Families were alerted. Elderly residents were assisted into vehicles. Porch lights flickered on across the community as people stepped outside trying to understand what was happening. Some looked confused. Others looked frightened. The wind continued to strengthen. Tree branches swayed overhead. Dry leaves skittered across the pavement. Through it all, Scout kept moving. Ethan noticed something strange. Every time the dog reached a particular house, he lingered longer. A small white home near the edge of the neighborhood. Scout circled the property repeatedly, barking toward the front porch. Then he ran back toward Ethan before returning again. The pattern repeated 3 times. Ethan followed him. The house belonged to Eleanor Hayes, an 82-year-old widow who had lived there for nearly 40 years. Her porch swing creaked softly in the growing wind. A flower garden lined the walkway. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Ethan knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Scout began pacing rapidly, his tail low, his eyes fixed on the house. Ethan felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. Then through a nearby window, he noticed a faint light glowing inside. Someone was home, and judging by Scout's desperate behavior, they had no idea how quickly the situation around them was changing. Ethan tried the door handle. Locked. Through the front window, he could see the warm glow of a table lamp illuminating a quiet living room. Family photographs lined the walls. A knitted blanket rested neatly across a chair. Everything inside suggested peace. Everything outside suggested urgency. Scout barked sharply and pawed at the front steps. The Labrador's attention never left the house. Ethan knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Hayes," he called. "This is Captain Ethan Walker with the rescue team. We need to evacuate immediately." For several seconds, there was only silence. Then came the faint sound of movement from inside. Slow, unsteady. The deadbolt clicked. The door opened a few inches. Eleanor Hayes stood there wearing a light blue sweater and thick glasses. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. She looked more confused than frightened. "What in the world is all this noise?" she asked. Ethan exhaled quietly. Relief washed through him. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here right now. The wildfire is moving faster than expected." Eleanor glanced toward the smoky sky and frowned. "I have lived through fire seasons before. They always say it is worse than it is." Scout stepped forward and sat directly in front of her. The old woman looked down at him. For the first time, her expression softened. "Well, hello there." The Labrador stared back with unwavering focus. Then he gave a low whine. Not a frightened sound, not a demanding one. It sounded almost like concern. Eleanor reached down and gently touched his head. "You seem worried, do you not?" Scout immediately turned toward the road and barked. Ethan noticed the change in her face. Something about the dog's behavior reached her in a way his warnings had not. The wind suddenly gusted through the neighborhood, carrying a stronger wave of smoke. This time Eleanor smelled it too. Her eyes lifted toward the western horizon. The orange glow had become impossible to ignore. It reflected faintly against the low clouds overhead. "Oh my," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "We do not have much time." She hesitated for only a moment. "I need my photo albums." Ethan almost smiled despite the tension. Every evacuation seemed to begin with the same request. Not money, not jewelry, memories. 2 minutes, he said. Eleanor disappeared inside. Scout remained on the porch, watching the street. Around them, the neighborhood was changing. More vehicles were pulling into driveways. More residents were stepping outside carrying bags, blankets, and family keepsakes. The quiet routine of an ordinary evening had vanished. In its place came urgency. Not panic, just determination. People helping neighbors. Strangers holding doors. Volunteers loading wheelchairs into vans. The kind of small kindnesses that appeared when communities faced hardship together. Eleanor returned carrying 2 worn albums pressed against her chest. Ethan escorted her toward the rescue truck. As they reached the vehicle, Scout suddenly froze. His ears lifted. His body stiffened. Ethan noticed it immediately. The Labrador turned his head toward a cluster of houses farther down the road. Then he began running. Fast. Purposeful. Ethan watched him disappear around a corner. "Scout," one of the volunteers called. But the dog did not stop. Eleanor glanced after him. "That dog knows something," she said quietly. Ethan felt the same uneasy feeling returning. Scout had already been right once. He climbed back into the truck and keyed his radio. "I am following the Labrador," he said. Several seconds of silence followed. Then a responder answered. "Following the dog?" Ethan looked toward the corner where Scout had vanished into the growing haze. "Trust me," he replied. "We cannot afford not to." And somewhere beyond the drifting smoke, Scout was already leading them toward the next life that needed saving. Scout ran through the haze with a speed that seemed impossible after everything he had already done. His paws struck the pavement in quick bursts as he cut between houses and across front lawns. Ethan followed in the rescue truck, keeping the Labrador in sight whenever the smoke allowed. Streetlights glowed faintly through the gray air. The smell of burning pine had become stronger now, mixed with the dry scent of dust carried by the rising wind. Ahead, Scout turned sharply onto a narrow side street lined with older homes. Most of the residents had already begun evacuating. Driveways stood empty. Front doors were closed. Curtains fluttered in open windows as gusts swept through the neighborhood. Then Scout stopped. He planted himself in front of a small yellow house at the end of a cul-de-sac and began barking. Loud, repeated, urgent. Ethan stepped out of the truck and hurried toward him. The house looked quiet. Too quiet. A bicycle leaned against the garage wall. A garden hose lay coiled beside a flower bed. Nothing seemed unusual, yet Scout refused to move. He barked again and scratched lightly at the front door. Ethan knocked hard. "Rescue team," he called. "Is anyone inside?" No answer. The Labrador whined and circled toward the side of the house. Ethan followed. As they rounded the corner, he noticed a small basement window partially open. Through it came the faint sound of music. Ethan froze. Someone was down there. He crouched near the window and called out. A few seconds later, a teenage boy appeared at the bottom of the stairs inside. He looked startled. Headphones hung around his neck. "What is going on?" he shouted. Relief flooded through Ethan. "You need to leave right now." The boy blinked in confusion. "I did not hear any sirens." Ethan glanced toward the western sky. The orange glow had spread farther across the horizon. Smoke drifted between the houses like fog. "You do not have time to wait for sirens." Moments later, the boy emerged carrying a backpack. His name was Tyler, 17 years old, home alone while his parents worked outside town. He had been listening to music in the basement and had not noticed the evacuation alerts. Scout sat beside him, tail gently tapping the ground. Tyler stared at the Labrador in disbelief. "This dog came looking for me?" Ethan nodded. "Looks that way." Tyler knelt and rubbed Scout behind the ears. The Labrador accepted the affection for exactly 2 seconds before standing again. His attention shifted toward the street. Ethan noticed it immediately. Scout was not finished. The dog began moving once more, heading deeper into the neighborhood. This time, several rescue volunteers had joined the search. Word was spreading quickly about the Labrador leading responders to people who needed help. Nobody laughed about following the dog anymore. Nobody questioned it. They simply followed. As they moved through the smoky streets, Scout suddenly slowed. His ears lifted. His nose pointed toward the community church near the center of town. The old brick building stood beneath a cluster of towering pines. Warm light glowed through the stained glass windows. Ethan felt a chill despite the heat in the air. Evening services were scheduled there tonight. And if Scout was heading that way, it meant one thing. More people were still inside. Scout reached the church steps and stopped beneath the stained glass windows. The old building stood quiet against the smoky sky, its white steeple rising above the drifting haze like a beacon from another time. Through the colorful glass, warm light spilled onto the lawn. Voices echoed faintly from inside. Ethan counted at least a dozen vehicles parked nearby. More than a dozen people. Maybe many more. The Labrador barked sharply and raced toward the front entrance. By the time Ethan arrived, Scout was already scratching at the wooden doors. A volunteer pulled one open. The scent of candle wax and polished wood drifted into the evening air. Inside, families sat gathered for a community prayer service. Children occupied the front rows while elderly couples sat quietly beside them. None of them seemed aware of how rapidly conditions were changing outside. Pastor Michael Reynolds looked up from the pulpit as Ethan entered. The pastor was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and kind blue eyes. Concern crossed his face immediately when he saw the rescue uniforms. Ethan wasted no time. "Everyone needs to evacuate now." A hush swept across the room. Parents exchanged worried glances. The pastor stepped forward. "Is it that serious?" Ethan turned toward the stained glass window nearest the altar. Through the colored panes, the western sky glowed a deeper orange than before. Even from inside the church, the faint smell of smoke had become noticeable. It is more serious than anyone realizes. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Scout walked calmly down the center aisle. His paws clicked softly against the wooden floor. Every eye followed him. He stopped beside a young girl sitting near the front. She could not have been older than 8. Her blonde hair was tied with a blue ribbon. Scout gently pressed his nose against her hand. The girl smiled and stroked his ears. Something about the simple moment seemed to break the tension. The pastor nodded slowly. "Everyone gather your families. We leave together." The congregation rose almost immediately. Parents collected children. Volunteers assisted older residents. Within minutes, the church transformed from a place of quiet reflection into a place of coordinated movement. Yet there was no panic, only purpose. Outside, the wind intensified again. Ash floated through the parking lot in steady waves. Ethan checked his radio. New reports were arriving every minute. The fire had crossed another ridge. Several roads were now considered unsafe. Estimated arrival times were shrinking. His stomach tightened. The original evacuation route led east toward the highway. It had always been considered the safest path out of Cedar Hollow. But as fresh updates crackled through the radio speaker, a troubling picture emerged. Conditions along that route were changing rapidly. Too rapidly. Scout seemed to sense it. As families emerged from the church, the Labrador moved toward the line of vehicles waiting to depart. Then he stopped. His ears lifted. He stared east. Not for a second. Not for a moment. He stared for nearly half a minute without moving. Then he turned away from the highway entirely. Ethan watched him begin walking toward a narrow gravel road that disappeared into the darkness beside a dry creek bed. Few people used that road anymore. Most locals barely remembered it existed. Scout glanced back once. Then he continued toward the forgotten path as though he already knew something the maps did not. The gravel road looked forgotten by time. Weeds pushed through the edges. Old fence posts leaned at uneven angles. The dry creek bed beside it twisted through the valley like a pale ribbon beneath the smoky sky. Scout moved ahead without hesitation. His pace was steady now, almost purposeful, as though he had already chosen the path long before anyone else knew they would need it. Ethan stepped from the rescue truck and watched the Labrador disappear farther down the road. Around him, families waited beside their vehicles. Parents held children close. Elderly residents sat quietly while volunteers checked supplies and counted names. The wind carried another wave of ash across the gathering. Somewhere beyond the hills, the orange glow brightened again. Ethan raised his radio. New reports crackled through the speaker. The voice on the other end sounded tense. Conditions along the eastern highway had deteriorated rapidly. Visibility was dropping. Traffic was slowing. Several emergency units were already being redirected. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The highway had been their primary evacuation route from the beginning. If that route became compromised, hundreds of people could find themselves trapped in congestion with very little time to adjust. He looked toward Scout. The dog had stopped near a bend in the creek and was waiting. Watching. Ethan climbed into his truck and slowly followed. One by one, the line of vehicles moved behind him. Headlights pierced the haze. Tires crunched over loose gravel. The convoy stretched nearly a quarter-mile along the forgotten road. As they rounded the first bend, something remarkable became clear. The creek bed created a natural corridor through the valley. The terrain dipped lower here, shielded by rocky slopes and open ground. Smoke still drifted overhead, but visibility remained far better than on the main highway. Ethan checked the map mounted beside his seat. He had lived near Cedar Hollow for years, yet he barely remembered this route. Decades ago, it had been used by ranchers and maintenance crews. Most residents had forgotten it existed. Scout continued forward. Several volunteers exchanged amazed glances. Nobody was questioning the dog anymore. The Labrador had already found residents who would have been overlooked. He had led them to the church. Now he seemed to be leading an entire community toward safety. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The convoy continued through the valley while darkness settled across the landscape. Children slept against their parents' shoulders. Engines hummed softly. The mood inside the vehicles shifted from fear to cautious hope. Then Ethan's radio came alive again. This time the message brought silence to every responder listening. The eastern highway had become unusable. Conditions had changed so quickly that officials were closing portions of the route entirely. Had the evacuation continued in that direction, hundreds of residents would have faced dangerous delays. Ethan slowly lowered the radio. For several moments he said nothing. Ahead, Scout trotted through the beam of the headlights, his tail moving gently from side to side. The Labrador did not know maps. He did not understand forecasts or emergency reports. Yet somehow he had guided them away from the very road everyone else believed was safest. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced toward the families traveling behind him. Children, grandparents, neighbors. Entire households moving together through the night. Then he looked back at the dog leading the way. In the quiet glow of the headlights, Scout appeared almost ordinary. Just a Labrador walking along a gravel road. But every person following him knew the truth. Without him, they might never have found this path at all. The convoy emerged from the creek valley just after midnight. Ahead, a A wide stretch of open farmland spread beneath the smoky sky. For the first time in hours, people began to breathe easier. Engines slowed. Families stepped from their vehicles. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Elderly residents wrapped blankets around their shoulders and looked back toward the distant hills where a faint orange glow still lingered against the horizon. They were safe, or at least they believed they were. Ethan climbed from his truck and immediately searched for Scout. The Labrador stood several yards away near a wooden fence line. His chest rose and fell heavily. Ash clung to his coat. His paws were dusty from miles of running. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the darkness behind them. Watching. Waiting. The rescue teams began establishing a temporary gathering area. Volunteers distributed bottled water. Medical staff checked on older residents. Pastor Reynolds moved quietly among the families, offering calm words and reassuring smiles. It should have felt like the end of the crisis. Instead, Ethan felt an uneasy weight in his chest. Something about Scout's behavior told him the night was not over yet. A sudden burst of radio traffic broke the silence. Multiple emergency channels came alive at once. Reports poured in from different units across the county. Ethan listened carefully. Then his expression changed. Several responders nearby fell silent as well. The wildfire had accelerated again. Strong winds had pushed it across terrain faster than anyone predicted. Entire sections of the eastern evacuation corridor had become impassable less than 30 minutes after the convoy abandoned it. Vehicles that had remained on that route were now being redirected through alternate access roads. Ethan slowly lowered the radio. Around him, nobody spoke. The realization settled over the gathering like a quiet prayer. They had not escaped by minutes. They had escaped by moments. Had they delayed? Had they trusted the original route? Had they waited for additional confirmation? The outcome could have been very different. Ethan looked toward Scout. The Labrador finally relaxed and lowered himself onto the ground. For the first time all night, he seemed tired. Truly tired. His head rested on his paws. His eyes half closed. Ethan walked over and knelt beside him. The dog lifted his gaze briefly. In that moment, memories flooded back. The years of rescue work. The emergencies. The uncertainty. The people saved and the people lost. Every lesson had taught him that survival often depended on paying attention to small things. A sound, a feeling, a warning. Tonight, that warning had arrived on 4 paws. The wind softened as the hours passed. Families gathered beneath the stars that slowly reappeared through the thinning haze. Children slept against their parents. Neighbors shared blankets and quiet conversations. And throughout the temporary shelter area, one story spread from person to person. The story of a Labrador who refused to stop running. A dog who barked at doors, led rescuers through forgotten roads, and somehow stayed one step ahead of danger all night long. Scout never seemed to notice the attention. He simply rested beside Ethan, listening to the distant sounds of the valley, as if his job had never been to become a hero, only to make sure everyone made it home. Morning arrived quietly over the temporary shelter grounds. The sky, once stained with smoke and uncertainty, slowly turned pale blue above the rolling farmland. Dew shimmered across the grass. Birds returned to the fence lines as if the world itself was exhaling after a long and difficult night. Families emerged from tents and parked vehicles. Children laughed again. Neighbors shared coffee from paper cups. The fear that had followed them through the darkness began to loosen its grip. Captain Ethan Walker stood alone near the edge of the field, watching the sunrise paint gold across the horizon. Beside him rested Scout. The Labrador was asleep now, stretched comfortably beneath an old oak tree. His paws twitched occasionally as he dreamed. Looking at him, nobody would have guessed what he had done. He looked like any ordinary dog enjoying a peaceful morning. Yet all around the shelter, people spoke his name. Eleanor Hayes carried her photo albums close to her chest and told anyone who would listen about the dog who refused to leave her porch. Tyler spoke about the bark outside his basement window. Parents from the church recalled seeing Scout walk calmly down the center aisle before leading them away from danger. Each story sounded small by itself. Together, they formed something much larger. Around mid-morning, county officials arrived with updated reports. Cedar Hollow had suffered damage, but because residents evacuated when they did, lives had been protected. The timing had made all the difference. Ethan listened quietly. Then he looked toward Scout once more. The Labrador opened his eyes and slowly stood. His tail wagged exactly twice before he wandered over and rested his head against Ethan's leg. The gesture was simple, trusting, familiar. Ethan knelt beside him and removed a small rescue identification tag from his pocket. It was nothing expensive, just a polished metal marker used by local responders. He attached it gently to Scout's collar. The tag caught the sunlight for a moment and flashed like a tiny star. Scout tilted his head as if wondering what all the attention was about. Ethan smiled. It was the first completely genuine smile he had worn in a very long time. Around them, conversations softened. People watched quietly. No speeches were given. No grand ceremony followed. None was needed. Some moments speak for themselves. The wind moved gently through the grass. Children ran across the field, chasing one another beneath the warming sky. Families prepared to return home and begin rebuilding whatever needed rebuilding. Life was moving forward again. Ethan rested a hand on Scout's shoulder and looked toward the distant valley. Over the years, he had learned many lessons about courage. Sometimes courage looked like firefighters racing toward danger. Sometimes it looked like neighbors helping neighbors. And sometimes, on very rare occasions, courage arrived with muddy paws, a tired tail, and a heart that refused to give up on people. Scout leaned against him for a moment longer before trotting off toward a group of laughing children. The sunlight followed him across the field. And in that quiet morning, with an entire community safe behind him, the Labrador simply walked on, unaware that he had become the kind of miracle people remember for the rest of their lives.